Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. Let's get started. Let's break down everything that's been happening in this case. And joining me are two very special guests. First up, Professor of Psychology from Stetson University, Dr. Chris Ferguson, and criminal defense attorney Gabriela Teresa Gonzalez. Great to have you both here. Doctor, I want to start with you. If she's convicted of this, if a jury determines that she did, in fact, murder this woman, what kind of person kills another person for presumably $34,000?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, at least the way that the facts of the crime seem to be emerging, at least, if allegedly she had done this to her friend, suggests that, there was a long pattern of her taking advantage of her friend's trust. And eventually, when she came under pressure from her friend, turning to the point of fatal violence in order to solve what looked like a otherwise unsolvable problem of where to recover this money from. So typically when we see this kind of level of aggression and particularly premeditation in a crime like this, we're looking at someone that is at high likelihood of having an antisocial personality disorder. So these are individuals who typically have a lack of a conscience, difficulty feeling remorse or empathy for other individuals. And can be quite predatory on other individuals. So it's looking like it may be someone who may have that type of set of symptoms or situations or behaviors. Again, without having done a psychological assessment on her, it's hard to be absolutely sure, but that's looking like the most probable psychological scenario for this individual.
Yeah, and for a lot of the defendants who've already been convicted of similar crimes, I'm sure they share similar characteristics. Okay, so I want to go into actually the timeline of events or as laid out by the prosecution. And Gabriela, we're going to go through it right now. So there's a couple of points that we want to mention. So here's the timeline according to the prosecution. You see at August 10th, the defendant adds the victim to her bank account. Remember, she wanted her to hold on to this $34,000 because Wright was in the middle of this contentious divorce with her then husband. Then you move on to August 16th, the $34,000 cashier's check is deposited. Fast forward to September 8th, that's the last day that Taylor Wright is seen alive. September 14th, the victim is reported missing. October 2017, the victim's remains are found on the defendant's aunt's property. And then you go to September 8th, and that was the last day that Taylor Wright was actually seen alive. Oh, okay, so that's just a repeat of what we saw before. And then you go, we have one more screen I want to show. So again, we're looking at the timeline here. And this is important because the defendant shows up to Cassandra Waller's house to pick up the victim. We learned this yesterday. Cassandra Waller is the ex-girlfriend or was the girlfriend of Taylor Wright. We look at 10 a.m., the victim and defendant leave. 11:30, so about an hour and a half later, the text messages from the victim stopped. So what happened during that period? You fast forward to 4 p.m., about almost 5 hours later. Cassandra sends a text to the defendant. The defendant says the victim is on a horse. You go to 7:30, Cassandra texts the defendant again. The defendant says that the victim got into an Uber. And then you go to 7:50, about 20 minutes later, Cassandra receives a text from the victim's phone, but we believe that she was dead at that point, so it would seem to suggest that the defendant was impersonating the victim. Gabrielle, based upon the timeline laid out by the prosecution, does this make sense to you, and what does it tell you about the crime?
Well, the state's case is definitely strong. The timeline certainly suggests that the defendant did, in fact, have something to do with this. I mean, the motive is there. You've got a victim who trusted the defendant with a significant amount of money in a tumultuous time in her life. When she went to go collect it, she was met with maybe tomorrow's, maybe next week, hang on a second, hold up. When in fact, the money was most likely spent. I think I heard yesterday that it was spent. Then you've got this timeline of the defendant picking up the victim, and then all of a sudden, things start to get weird. As we heard from the ex-girlfriend's testimony, she noticed a lot of really strange strange answers from the text messages. The victim was actually nervous about the upcoming divorce proceedings against her, when the text messages said that she was nervous about moving. So these inconsistent text messages with the conversations that the victim actually had with her ex-girlfriend does lend itself to the state's timeline and the state's theory of the case that it was the defendant who actually killed the victim.
Putting the defendant right there with the victim during this time, I mean, she was with her. There's no doubt about that. That is not a good move for the defense. So, doctor, let me ask you this. One of the things that we've seen during the course of this trial is we learned more about the victim, Taylor Wright, and you never want to cast the victim in a negative light. Having said that, when her girlfriend or her former girlfriend got on the stand, she talked about how Taylor Wright was abusing drugs at one point. She talked about how Taylor had actually cheated on her. And we're learning more, about this relationship and what she was dealing with in this contentious divorce with her husband by taking that $34,000 so he couldn't have it. Is these common characteristics for someone in her position at this point in life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, and again, it's as you said, we don't want to put too much blame on the victim, and it's kind of hard to know exactly what was going on psychologically for her in the situation. It sounds like she was under, a fairly tremendous amount of stress herself, and made this choice to put a lot of trust into a friend that, even homicide aside, was probably not a tremendously wise choice to have made. So, with some of these things, it seems to suggest maybe a pattern of a bit of impulsivity, particularly under times of stress for this particular victim. And, unfortunately, she may have put trust in a friend who she didn't realize had so much more nefarious traits that put her in a situation of danger. So we do tend to see this with a lot of homicides. That in criminology, we talk about this idea of victim-precipitated homicides in a way. That's not to place blame on the victim, but that sometimes victims can engage in behaviors that end up putting themselves at risk for becoming the victim of a crime. Right. And that this may be a situation where this particular individual was prone to engaging in riskier behaviors. That, again, doesn't mean she should have been a victim.
Right. No, but that's interesting, and it helps the prosecution's case. I guess, Gabriella, what's the other side? How could the defense exploit this? If this impulsivity, if this is what they want the jury to hear, is there any way they can exploit that to say to their advantage in saying that their client didn't do this?
Absolutely. The victim in this case is a tumultuous one, as stated earlier. She is someone with divorce proceedings. She's someone that's taking money from her husband and trying to hide it places. She's someone with a substance abuse problem. She's someone who treats her loved ones in a not so respectful way. So the defense is going to clamp onto this theory that this is not a good person and this is someone who probably did something that would suggest that she was responsible for her own death, whether it be partaking in risky behavior with other people other than the defendant, through her drug use, through her personal life, what have you. They're definitely going to clamp onto this theory that it was the victim's irresponsible behavior that caused her death and not the defendant's.
Well, it's an interesting story with a lot of different testimony we've heard so far. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to play you some of that testimony from people that knew Taylor Wright very well, including her ex-husband and her girlfriend. We'll be right back right after this.